Hi everyone, my name is McKenna Bailey and I'm on the marketing team here at Yonder. I'm excited to kick off a new series we're calling If Then Conversations. In each episode, we'll look at a different scenario that supply chain leaders are facing and discuss with our experts how we can react to those opportunities. Today, we're talking about how to mature sustainability efforts with our Chief Sustainability Officer at Yonder, Saskia Van Gendt. Welcome, Saskia.
Thank you. Looking forward to the conversation.
So to start off, we wanted to highlight the 2025 Supply Chain Compass. We had a spotlight on sustainability report, which showed that 68% of supply chain executives said that they feel the onus to help solve problems like climate change. But despite this majority, sustainability strategies are often deprioritized so that companies can focus on more urgent demands. So with that in mind, we wanted to talk about how we are now 10 years into the Paris Agreement with only 10 years left to reach the goals agreed upon in 2015. Major countries like India, China, and the EU missed their deadlines for 2025, and the United States pulled out entirely. So, our scenario is if deadlines for sustainability measures are imposed more strictly in the near future, what should executives be thinking about?
So, it is critical for executives to be looking at supply chains because we know that supply chains account for at least 60% of global carbon emissions. So, in order to meet those goals that have been set through the Paris agreements, countries and companies will need to look to supply chains to reduce emissions at the scale that's needed. And I believe that technology is really the only way that we can address those emissions at both the scale and the urgency that's required to mitigate the worst effects from climate change. So, for companies to act, we can break it down into two different phases. The first is measure, and the second is optimize. We know that effective decision making requires accurate data and also accredited reporting. So far, most companies have actually just focused on direct emissions. So that could be what's coming out of the smokestack or the tailpipe. And indirect emissions that are coming from the value chains have been much more challenging to quantify. But now, through supply chain management, we can directly get visibility to full value chain emissions and directly measure carbon emissions based on supply chain activity. This is resulting in much more accurate data directly around supply chain carbon emissions. And then once you have that data and reporting in place, companies need to be acting proactively to implement plans that are mitigating future carbon emissions. Supply chain management and sustainability solutions can actually help develop plans that prioritize carbon emission reduction while evaluating different trade-offs and do scenario planning to assess how those plans are tracking towards carbon reduction goals and mandates.
Our second scenario comes from the 2025 Supply Chain Compass main report, which said that 49% of companies reported investing in electric vehicles, with 60% saying they plan to invest in EVs in the next year. This aligns with the priorities of millennials and Gen Z who want to focus more on sustainability and represent two-thirds of decision makers in the global market. So, with that in mind, if customer sentiment and demands for more sustainable efforts outpace regulations, what should we be thinking about in that case?
So, electric vehicles are a really interesting use case just because the adoption is happening almost at two different ends of the spectrum. In the US, incentives we're seeing are actually rapidly being sunset. Meanwhile, in Europe and China, electric vehicle adoption is rapidly outpacing combustion engine vehicles. So, with that in mind, global companies will need to take a global approach to EV adoption. So, they'll need to take advantage of incentives, infrastructure, and consumer sentiment for EVs where they are strongest. In the US, companies will take a longer term view, factoring in cheaper operating costs and reduced maintenance. Over the past 5 years, we've actually seen executives consider what's good for society and people more when making decisions. So the benefit to society and people only accounted for about 35% of decision drivers a few years ago. And now we actually see it's more than 50%, 52% of decision drivers. This trend will mean that more comprehensive strategies for what sustainability means to implement and how to expand what exists. For example, transportation management solutions can also help companies maximize utilization of EV fleets by factoring in range and load limits and charging locations when designing loads and routes. In a long-term view, each sustainability strategy needs to be impactful in a variety of ways for the company and society.
The supply chain compass also revealed that there is a recognized link between sustainability, technology, and efficiency. However, fewer leaders have embraced technology related sustainability opportunities. Only 22% of executives have used data analytics for emissions tracking, for example. So, if supply chain executives start integrating sustainability related technologies, what can they start to see?
Well, first, I just want to acknowledge that it isn't too surprising that there's been slower adoption around sustainability technology. And by that, I've just observed that sustainability solutions have really been fragmented and have actually reinforced silos that it can exist in companies between sustainability teams and supply chain teams. They're often very disconnected solutions that are only serving the sustainability team, and they can be extremely expensive and time consuming to operate. So I can imagine a lot of companies have tried to adopt those kind of solutions and ultimately stopped, investing in technology because they were ineffective. But the promising thing about sustainable supply chain management is that it can actually help companies reduce costs while addressing carbon and waste in the supply chain. Solutions can identify more efficient routes, reduce fuel costs, and optimize inventory plans to avoid waste and associated emissions and costs. Sustainability teams can also save time and cost associated with data collection and analysis, reporting, and compliance, which frees them up to develop and execute strategies to accelerate progress towards sustainability goals. So these solutions have come a long way, and adoption is much more straightforward and cost effective than ever.
Ultimately, the conversation about climate change and sustainable business operations are going to get more complex and more necessary from now on. It will not be a piece that can fit into our existing strategies. It must be foundational to how supply chains work and how they make decisions. So, thank you for joining us for an If Then conversation with Blue Yonder. We will see you next time.